Once again, very happy to have you here. In this panel, we hope to first maybe touch upon a little bit on the current status of the regulation around the world, particularly how MiCA is also perceived. Then we'll go a little bit into the current challenges that we have, and hopefully we finish also with some maybe takeaways also, well, how to actually go around current challenges that we have, how to solve them. So perhaps first question to you, Jan, if you could portray us a little bit of the landscape, current regulation, where do we stand in terms of the digital assets regulation around the world? We do have MiCA, of course, in Europe, but my question would be, are we very much advanced? How MiCA is perceived? How do you see this from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks very much, and looking forward to the discussion. So indeed, I think in Europe, and you're well aware of this, we have the legislation which is now firmly in the implementation stage, and I think you discussed this earlier this morning, which is of course also not without challenges, on the contrary. But I think we are having, I think, broadly the same similar picture in a number of jurisdictions, that you see a mix of indeed existing rules and legislation being applied indeed to crypto assets, and then on the other hand, indeed, this to be complemented by new, let's say, additional pieces of legislation, crypto-specific ones. I think in Europe, indeed, that's the MiCA part. I think in the UK also, and we'll surely hear about that in a moment from Lisa and colleagues, indeed, we have a similar picture. In the US, I think you are aware this is also still the discussion, indeed, where the law needs to be complemented in addition to applying it. And I think if you look to the other side, to the east, Japan and Singapore, I think we have always the same similar picture. Where exactly the line is drawn and where, let's say, new legislation is created as opposed to actually applying existing one, that really also depends on the different national existing frameworks. And I think we should not forget, of course, that securities, but also payments legislation is actually quite different in different countries. So in that sense, it's only natural that here the specific approaches are a bit different. But overall, I think we are seeing this picture of a mix between existing and new pieces. And I think the fundamental principles are in these jurisdictions I mentioned quite similar, and I think that's for me also the merit a bit of the work of the Financial Stability Board and the other, let's say, international standard setters to whom we have also actively contributed actually to set a bit of a general framework on what are the key principles, you know, on stable coins and the reserve, on let's say trading venues, on client assets treatment and all the rest of it. So I think while the international standards are naturally limited, I think to certain principles, I think they still provide a good pathway and guiding line on in which now we see all these different jurisdictions go. So in that sense, I think this is for me rather a positive picture. I would not, of course, exclude, and it's very clear that then in practice, applying these things in each jurisdiction will be difficult. Applying these things across jurisdictions will possibly be even more challenging, and we see many of the issues only in practice. Cooperation between supervisors, how does it work if I'm recognized in one country, but then another supervisor has very different requirements? Maybe the supervisors even want opposite things, basically, may also happen. Luckily in Europe, of course, we have with MiCA, we have the passporting for this, but of course, firms are global. So in that sense, that will require a lot of discussions also with the supervisors, a lot of interaction. So really, we are only at the start of making all of this work, I would say.
You did touch upon already a little bit on the issues that are related to actually application of the law. Maybe before we get into that, Ian, I'd like to maybe direct this question to you. Speaking of the forest that already been mentioned by Jan, we mentioned FSB, there's also other international forests. What is actually their roles in global regulatory collaboration? What would you say is the most important aspects of them, considering that we deal with digital assets, an extremely fast developing phenomena that it's very difficult to catch? And what would you say is the most important role that those international fora can fulfill here?
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, blockchain, for hosting this amazing event. Now, yeah, I don't see this as a binary single question. I mean, we at CryptoUK and the work that global trade associations do in collaboration with the international standard setters has been ongoing for a number of years. IDAXA works very closely with the Financial Action Task Force, and that international standard setter was one of the first to come forth and provide guidance for competent authorities to regulate against AML, regulate against money laundering and terrorist financing. And now we actually have the transposition of those rules into law across many jurisdictions, including recently the UK. Now, what is most important is global collaboration. Obviously, we know this industry is global in nature. Blockchains don't care about regulations or geographical restrictions, and so assets move at lightning speed across different jurisdictions, just like data does across the internet. Now, one thing that I would say is extremely important, and we're very fortunate both in the UK and on the continent, that policymakers and the regulators assigned with the specific areas of regulation, whether it be prudential or consumer, have been very engaged with the industry. And that for me is vital, both at that international level and at the individual jurisdiction, to engage with industry, private practitioners, to help craft the right kind of regulation that is both proportionate and protects against the risks such as consumer harms and market integrity abuse that are intended. So yeah, in short, that's what I've seen in the number of years I've been working with the international standard setters, and we recently had some information or some guidance out from IOSCO regarding decentralized finance, and I was fortunate to be invited to go and speak at the round of events that they conducted at their annual meeting a few months ago in Asia. So it was really interesting to see the good work being done at that level, also engaging with industry.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Ian. Let me now maybe move into the other perspective that we have here present. So, Beata, if we look from the market perspective, and you as a global company that operates in multiple jurisdictions that has to look into all kinds of different legal frameworks, how do you perceive, where do we stand in terms of development of the global collaboration regulatory frameworks, and how do you actually deal with what you have to encounter in each of them, in each of the jurisdictions?
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So yes, indeed, Kraken is a global company. EU, UK, and the US are actually our three, I would say, main jurisdictions, really. So we look at the development of the rules, and actually we are encouraged for most part, especially, of course, here in the EU, but also the UK and to some extent the US. Because I think as a global company, what we need is first legal certainty and clarity. So we have that very much now in Europe, and that's been already said today. It still remains to be seen, but we're getting there. And second, next to the legal certainty and clarity, we need rules that are global, that work globally. That doesn't mean necessarily that they're exactly the same in each and every jurisdiction, because obviously, each jurisdiction is sovereign and can set their own rules and standards, but these rules need to be to some extent compatible. So I think we're definitely on the journey. We're on the way there. There are definitely advantages, for the EU to be the kind of the first mover with MiCA. But I think there are some advantages for the other jurisdictions as well, because they will have the benefits of the lessons learned, right? Because while MiCA is great, it probably didn't get everything 100% correct. And I think these lessons learned will be very important for all the other jurisdictions. And what do? We are very actively engaged in a number of dialogues, bilateral dialogues. Me personally, or us in the EU here, had a great, dialogues with the Commission, with the institutions, and now slowly moving onto ESMA. So I think it's really onto us on industry to also be part of the dialogue and educate. So that's what we do.
Thank you. You speak a lot about dialogues, and that's definitely something very important. I wonder, Lisa, if you could tell us, actually, we have engaged on this topic in many different forums and jurisdictions and all kinds of events, but do we actually have a good understanding of what digital assets are? And when you look into how different international standard setters approach them, how do you, what would you say do we have a common ground on what do we talk about? Do we have a common understanding in the end?
Thank you so much for having me here this afternoon. I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's wonderful to join your event. I think that's a fantastic question. It is really important that as legislators, we keep a pace with what's happening in this technological digital world that really is being created by the digital generation now. So things are moving at pace, and I think we had felt ourselves to be a bit behind consumers and the population at large, and of course our great innovators. So our goal is really to try to keep more so a pace, to provide a regulatory framework that can offer clarity and that can ensure that we have competition and that we have engagement and develop business. But this, as you say, will not just be in the UK, it will be internationally, and we do need to see those global standards to develop. And I think that's why communication and events like these are just so vital. We need to have that dialogue to make sure we're heading in the same direction. And that we can make sure for consumers there's that protection that they require, because as legislators, that's our point of principle as to where we start. But moving from that, I think the clarity is also, and the certainty is also very much required for businesses and business development and investors. So it's a win-win situation. And I think only with that dialogue and collaboration can we take this digital generation to the next step, which I think is such a potential and exciting time. We're on the cusp of it and so delighted to be part of that.
Thank you, Lisa. That's definitely very good points. We definitely need clarity, and as you said, there's still a room to go when it comes to understanding of where we talk about, where we stand. I wonder how this would mean, what this really means for one of our market participants here today. From a global company, what kind of challenges and real life challenges, what kind of examples you can give us of situations where you have to deal with this lack of clarity that was mentioned and this lack of common understanding that's very often existent around the world. What would you say are the main challenges you're dealing as a global company?
Right. So I think some of the main challenges is that the field is really fast moving. It's changing. So, you know, for the regulation to capture that, it needs to be, I guess, sufficiently flexible to some extent. But in terms of like, what are the concrete issues? So, for example, MiCA is, charging ahead. And for example, the stablecoin part is going to be applicable already next summer. So MiCA is quite clear on what stablecoins are, you know, how they should be regulated. And obviously, what happens then for us as a global exchange if they are regulated in some way here in the EU, but not in other jurisdictions, right? So what if the UK, US, or other parts of the world adopt legislation for stablecoins that is actually not compatible with this? How do we, as a platform, trading platform, deal with that? So this is I think a concrete example where I think we would really encourage and promote this international dialogue, so that's really the standards are as global as possible.
Would there be any example you could give us on how are you affected right now in real life, in real life cases?
Do you mean
like of application of a different law, for example, classification of different tokens that you have in your exchange?
Right. So I think for the time being, we are not really facing this issue, right? Because MiCA is not yet applicable. We have some regulatory footprint across the EU. You know, we are registered in a number of jurisdictions, including also in the UK. But I don't think we are currently facing this issue. But I think this issue will be dominating our days in the months to come.
I see, definitely. I'm wondering, looking at you, Jan, how do you actually react to this? Because perhaps this is not something, as Beata said, that we are dealing already now, but it's something that we know is going to come very soon. Do we have any ways to address this, to challenge this? Are we active on this front? How do we prepare ourselves in the future to be able to combat those kinds of issues?
Yeah, I think the answer, there are two parts of it. I mean, one, of course, let's say you will have to have your license in the various countries where you're being marketed. Of course, in the EU, it's one license for 27. But then if you are marketing in other countries, which most of you do, indeed, it means different licenses. That's one thing. And I think in a business which faces also consumers and end users, in the end, I think that's somehow also unavoidable. I think the second thing is what then, once you are licensed, indeed, what are the actual substantive requirements which the supervisor gives you? And on that one, I have the impression I see the stablecoin area is particularly sensitive because there are a lot of requirements, well, because you give a particular strong promise as well. But in that sense, I find it quite good that the international principles by the FSB, but also by the other standard setters, are actually quite detailed in this part. I mean, you may not always like everything which is in there, but I think it has the benefit that indeed the key requirements, the holding of the reserve, the redemption rights, the other ones actually are quite detailed. And to the extent I see and I know from the cooperation with colleagues in the UK or in the US or elsewhere, indeed, I think in Japan, indeed, the requirements are, let's say, being implemented in quite similar ways, and the ideas are quite similar behind. I don't exclude, and I know that in practice, actually, we will come up with, let's say, we will encounter specific difficulties. But at this stage, I have the impression that at least the general setup is done in a way together with the various jurisdictions, actually, that should, let's say, avoid those issues which are currently foreseeable.
I see, definitely. That's very interesting. Actually, what I wonder, since you mentioned a lot about MiCA, Lisa, I wanted to reach out to you and ask you how MiCA is actually perceived from the UK perspective. What do you see in MiCA being? Do you see MiCA as a good example for yourself? And would you say, what kinds of regulations would you like to copy into your own jurisdictions, and which one you think still needs some kind of improvement that you'd like to change or add, or maybe do completely different?
Thank you so much. No, we've been very enthusiastic to see the development of MiCA. And I think when other jurisdictions are creating best practice, that's always something that we would seek to look very closely at and emulate where that's working. Part of the cross-party group that I chair in the Parliament, part of our remit this year, is actually to be addressing international standards and best practice and looking at the positives from other jurisdictions and bringing those back to the UK, and also thinking about where perhaps we can make some differences in terms of our own regulatory framework as well and legislation going forward. So that's still a bit of a work in progress for us currently, but we're coming out to Paris and Brussels later this year, and we're also going to be visiting some other jurisdictions. I've already been out to Zug in the past, and we learned a great deal from other legislators, not just about the legislatory components itself, but thinking about the whole of the sector. What's really key is not just the legislation around about financial services, which we've been very focused on, I have to say, but also thinking about careers of the future for our young people, our digital generation coming forward, thinking about inclusion piece in this sector as well, making sure that the capacity and the capability and the entrepreneurship is open to all, and thinking about the other sorts of aspects in terms of research and development and training in our university and college sector. So we're beginning to take a much wider approach to this because we know that this sector has great potential, and we want to make sure that the UK partners with other jurisdictions and that there is that interoperability that is required moving forward.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That's very interesting. Looking at Ian right now, and I'm wondering, since in different jurisdictions, particularly in the US, we see a concept of self-regulation, which is, a way for the industry to take the lead and proactively prepare themselves for all kinds of, introduce certain rules, certain measures that would ensure achievement of a certain standard that's required by the regulator. I'm wondering, would that be a sort of a solution that we could implement in the future to strengthen the general global regulatory collaboration, but also simply safety and legitimacy of the sector?
Yeah, to come on to the SRO, self-regulatory organisation model, just to sort of echo what Lisa, Dr. Cameron was saying around the knowledge sharing and going around speaking to other policymakers and regulators to really find out what's working, what's not working. A good example of what we do, CryptoUK, is partner with global trade associations to see whether we can learn on regulation that's live. For example, in Japan, and this feeds into the SRO question, because the Japanese model, they have an SRO in place. The Blockchain Association was given powers by the JFSA, the regulator there, to regulate exchanges a few years ago. And so we work with them to create understanding regarding specific issues that are live there and not live here. For example, the travel rule, or is now live in the last few weeks in the UK. And so we want to understand from them how that particular self-regulatory model works for crypto businesses. Now, this is something that has been used in the UK previously and other jurisdictions. The US has FISMA, which regulates the broker market. The UK has this FX code, which regulates FX spot, and also within crowdfunding. Now, it's not something that there is appetite for. We have suggested it as an industry to our regulator, and I've suggested it to government. There is the argument on the plus side that can be made, because the industry is so dynamic and things move very quickly, that an SRO model may be able to react to that much faster. A good example would be prior to the financial promotions regime coming into the UK, we suggested to the FCA and the Advertising Standard Authority that we, the Trade Association, come up with a 10-point plan as to how our members should adhere to the framework, such as clear, not misleading, quote risks, and don't over exaggerate certain aspects of the promotion. Now, that obviously didn't work, because now we have a policy. Now we have a primary legislation that is being rolled out in the forthcoming weeks to regulate promotion. So, I mean, personally, it has advantages, but it also has a number of disadvantages. So it just depends on what the activity is, perhaps, and what the industry, whether there's enough support from industry to actually make it so. So it's a bit of a mixed answer.
Thank you very much, Ian. I want to also touch upon another issue that I think is also visible, and as mentioned as Beat, as one of the most important ones, which is, well, the technology develops very extremely quickly, and we started MiCA some time ago, and definitely new services, new types of phenomena develop on blockchain technology since then. I wonder, Jan, if you could tell us, how can regulation keep up the pace with the technology? And for the prism of your experience in MiCA, and also the role of the standard setters bodies that we discussed earlier, what would you say would be the answer to that? Like, can we actually keep up the pace? And if yes, how do we do it? And if we cannot, what we should do to at least make sure that we have, well, regulation that's going to be feasible?
I think it's completely true. The technology has a quick pace. Adoption of technology is sometimes a bit slower in a way. So I would definitely agree with you. If you look at the cutting edge, regulation will not always be there, simply because the regulators need to first understand the issues. However, when I see now the experience of the past 3, 4, 5 years since we have been preparing MiCA, working on MiCA, also the DLT pilot, I have to say, actually, the fundamental issues have not changed every 6 months, basically. I mean, I think we had 2, 3 fundamental developments, and of course, lessons to be learned. But sometimes I also feel in some areas even that in the way the regulation is maybe even a bit ahead, and that actually, when you look at actually market implementation, it doesn't really happen yet very much. Well, it happens in a completely opaque and unregulated way, but not in a serious way, if I can say so. So in that sense, I'm quite confident actually in this space that we have we are able to keep up the pace. pace, and we are sometimes even ahead. And I think it's now a bit also indeed to the market to actually implement the rules and then let's say see how they can work in a way. I think I'm relatively confident on this. And then, I mean, we are more than happy to learn and to adjust quickly. I think we've shown that we can react quickly if that's necessary. The supervisory authorities have also some broad discretion, for example, then later on to change technical standards. So there is quite a lot of flexibility in the system. But I think, let's say, when it is about regulating the mainstream, not the cutting edge, but the mainstream adoption, basically, sometimes regulation is slow, but sometimes also actually adoption doesn't go very fast. So overall, I think we're still in a relatively good spot there.
Yeah, I see you talk a little bit about the EU context here. I'm looking at Ian now because I wonder also, what would you say? Would you agree with all what Jan just said about the EU also would be applicable at the sort of global level? Are we actually ahead very often when it comes to regulation?
Yeah, I mean, everybody that I speak to, and I can only speak to my own experience, thinks that MiCA is a fantastic first step. We know regulation is a blunt instrument, and especially within this particular new industry, many of the current existing frameworks in place don't fit. And we always go around, especially talking, for example, to Financial Action Task Force about putting a square peg in a round hole, especially around capturing data, transferring to self-hosted wallets. And we had a big discussion when we were drafting the policy with the government here in the UK around how to actually implement that when you're transferring assets to a self-hosted wallet. And we actually were very pleased that our government treasury, when we were talking to their illicit finance team, heard us and listened to us and rolled out a proportionate approach to sending assets to self-hosted wallets. But I mean, it's just the beginning, right? It's a first pass. There's a lot more work left to be done around, whether it's Web3, DeFi, NFT market in MiCA, and the UK is facing exactly the same questions, where we have a consultation that closed earlier in there to regulate the overarching unbacked crypto assets sector. We expect the results of that consultation to be released imminently, along with a package of other policies, including some stablecoin regulation to look at the secondary legislation around the details of how stablecoin issuers will think about capital onshore, offshore, which is a big issue in the UK versus the Europe as a policy specific detail. But I mean, what a great piece of work. My personal opinion is, to all those folks that worked on that, and you guys at Blockchain for Europe, and especially Robert will know, back in the beginning of 2020, we worked quite closely to collaborate on our responses to ensure the industry, approach this from a joined up approach.
Thanks so much, Ian, also for the personal reference to Blockchain for Europe, which I'm a part of. We're going slowly to the end of the panel, and by the way, everyone, if you have any questions, I hope to have a couple of minutes to also grab some from you, so you can get them ready. I wonder also, thank you very much for that. What will be the future of the global regulatory collaboration on digital assets? And I wonder, Lisa, if you could see from your perspective, going around the world and working in various groups, why do you see the future of regulation? How can we make it better, simply?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be, as already has been pointed out, a joined up approach. It has to be regulators working with government and working with industry and consumers. And only when you bring all of the pieces of the puzzle together can you have a regulatory framework and system globally that's fit for purpose. And it's just very, very vital, because my first step into this arena was really from a constituent who'd lost a lot of money and experienced a rug pull scam. So we have to, as legislators, remember, that we're representing people and their interests, and what we want to see is a fantastic industry develop with all of its potential, but we want to make it safe for people. And I think that when we have these underlying premises that we can agree on globally, then, we can move forward. I think there are also just really important issues in terms of collaborations, particularly the US, UK, the West, Western world, really, to take forward. And I'm thinking very much about central bank digital currencies, etc. So there are global issues to look at for legislators too, in respect of the developing technological world that we live in. So we're grappling with it, but the more we have that dialogue, the more we engage with fantastic events like this, the more we listen to each other and bring all of the people to the table, the better regulatory frameworks will develop, and those will be much more likely to be interoperable and practical for usage around the world.
Thank you, Lisa. You mentioned collaboration, you mentioned industry, but how do you see yourself, your role in all of that shaping of the global future regulatory framework? Where do you think the industry should stand in this process?
I think the industry plays a huge role in this process, because I think it's really on us to educate the policymakers, to help them understand the blockchain technology and the individual assets. There's really, I mean, if you look at the, for example, European Parliament, right? How many MEPs worked on MiCA? And then if you try to think like, okay, how many actually do have a deep understanding of the blockchain technology? I think we have a lot of work to do there. And it's not just the European Parliament, it's really the legislature around the world. So we definitely need to promote the dialogue, create more dialogue, and yeah, don't hesitate to talk to us either. So yeah.
So you definitely want to be at the table. You definitely want to be involved,
Yeah.
which is also in line with what Lisa was saying. I wonder, Jan, perhaps why don't we make MiCA as a golden standard? Maybe this could be an example for other jurisdictions that could be implemented. Maybe that could be a sort of a solution for the future regulation of assets.
Well, I know this would, of course, be, let's say, a paradise where you just have one rule applying across the globe. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's the reality. I think I already said it before. I mean, blockchain or DLT and crypto regulation doesn't come from scratch. It starts somewhere, and it starts about kind of established structure of supervision, securities, payments regulation, and that's quite different from one jurisdiction to the other. So I'm afraid every country and every jurisdiction have to find a bit their own, let's say, way of kind of implementing these general principles. And in that sense, also, I think that the challenge for the next years will simply be this. I mean, implementing, making this cooperation real, kind of going from kind of the theory of possible frictions to actually the practice of what are the actual issues and how can we actually in practice resolve them on those on the basis of the principles which I agreed.
Forgive me this sort of tricky question to you, because in fact what I was wanted to ask you is, are we actually pushing for making MiCA as some form of a golden standard around the world? Are we being active in the national setting bodies as European Union to make sure that what we define in MiCA is something that we'd like to see also in other jurisdictions?
I mean, I think where there's interest, we certainly explain what has brought us to adopt MiCA. But I think then in the end, I mean, we're not in a mission to basically to kind of make MiCA the global standard. I mean, I think if people find that there are good parts of it, then I'm sure they will read it and they will maybe make something out of it. And for the rest, I think that every jurisdiction knows quite well actually what's the appropriate regulation in their area. As long as it is based on the global standards, I think, which are now around, I think that's I think perfectly fine and probably the best approach.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll take it as a no, that we're not pushing to make MiCA, let's say, widely adopted. Ian, if you could just, as a closing remark, tell us a little bit more, how do you see our journey towards achieving a global effective regulatory collaboration between different jurisdictions around the world, which is extremely difficult, as we just discussed?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a wonderful thing, wouldn't it, if we just had one set of global standards that everyone implemented, but we know that will not happen. However, what I do know is in the UK, when MiCA was first proposed, the regulator reached out to us and other trade associations to also seek input in really what are the good parts and what are the bad parts. And the UK often adopts this second mover approach and has, if you like, taken some of the good parts and left some of the not so good parts behind. And rather than go for a full bespoke regime, has gone for a blend of using existing financial frameworks and some new bespoke. regulatory perimeters. So yeah, I will just sort of close with reminding this group that, yeah, get involved, whether it's with a trade association or directly with another entity that supports the development as a bit of an innovative technology, because we're only at the beginning of this journey. And once we have this regulatory clarity, we'll start to see adoption increase significantly. And I talk to a lot of traditional financial service providers, and the capital is just on the waiting lines, ready to step into and use some of the innovative benefits, such as automated market makers, decentralized autonomous organizations. There's a whole host of innovations that have taken place in the last few years that can be rolled out into traditional financial services. So really exciting time to be involved.
Thanks so much, Ian. For those great words. We have 3 more minutes, and I'm looking at round if there's any question that I'd like to ask our panelists. Is there any question I can't see also in the chat? But there is nothing here, I suppose. All right, so let me then ask maybe this final question to you, Jan. We talked a little bit about how the complexity of digital assets, about the clarity that we still need to achieve, about the fact that the technology is still developing, although regulation, as you say, at least in Europe, is still quite okay with that. But I wonder, do we have enough qualified staff to actually be able to follow, to supervise, to be in anti-money laundering, soon authority, to European Commission, in ESMA, in EBA, a staff that would be somehow able to follow those developments, to, well, not join the market, but be on the other side and understand what's going on, understand what's staking, as we said, as we had in our just the previous session, understand all kinds of different phenomena like DeFi that are going to come. Are we ready for this revolution or evolution? And if not, what can we do to be ready?
Yeah, I think that is indeed one of the big challenges of implementation, to have the right people and the right staff, because of course very often they also then, if they are knowledgeable, they get good offers from the private sector as well. So I think this is something which, well, I think it is an internal challenge for financial supervisors beyond crypto. It is not just on crypto. And I think from our side, it is, as I said, it's a challenge, but we see some positive developments. I mean, essentially the whole discussion, I think, around also the MiCA framework here, if you want, has also been a bit of, I mean, you spoke about education before. I never don't like this word so much, basically, but it's more of has been very much of a common learning process, actually, for many operators as well. And that involved many authorities, that spreads now at the ESMA and the EBA work. I think is quite similar, where indeed you have these fora where people are talking together. I think the international fora are very similar effects as well. And secondly, from our side, we have a very concrete, specific program, the European Digital Financial Supervisory Academy, which is actually financed from our DG Reform colleagues here in the European Commission, where every year dozens and dozens of supervisors are actually trained in digital finance, and crypto is a big part of it, basically. I know that the SSM, the ECB, has a similar program. So I think we are both, of course, working on, indeed, let's say, recruiting the right staff, but also on upskilling the staff which is there. I have to say that if you compare the level of discussion you have today compared to maybe the understanding and discussion 2 or 3 years ago, I think we see a big leap. And so I'm at least half confident that people will manage.
That's perfect. And with those positive remarks that we both need understanding, but the understanding is coming, as you said, and those skills are going to be present also in those in the public sector, that also the market needs to be able to have the clarity around the rules and what's going to be done. With those positive remarks, I'd like to once again thank you very much for being with us today. And I'm giving the floor back to you, Tommaso.